J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
We're going to do a little Death Scenes 101, okay? I'm going to teach you how to work death scenes because I think this tells us something about God's existence, if God does exist. So let's just do a death scene together. We're going to look at a dead guy laying on the floor. So here he is. Now the question is this a murder? Should I work it as a murder? Or is this just another kind of death? There are 4 ways to die, and the first 3 are not criminal. You could die a number of ways. Now, what I have so far is I just have a dead guy laying face down. How am I going to determine how he died? I'm going to use a process called abductive reasoning, which I think works quite well if we're trying to determine other kinds of historical truths too. But what we do is we make 2 lists that begin with an E. The first list is a list of evidences, and the next list is a list of explanations, ways to explain the evidence. So far, evidentially, all we have is a dead guy laying face down. Well, how do you explain dead guys laying face down? Well, there are 4 ways. Can you imagine how you might explain a dead guy laying face down? Natural death. That's very good. Natural death is one of those ways. Also, he might have died by some accident. Or he might have committed suicide. And the last one, of course, would be that he was murdered. I only care if it's this one. If I get there and it's one of these first 3, I get to go home. So I'm really hoping it's one of those first 3, right? And I want to figure out quickly whether I'm stuck here all night. So I have to figure out, okay, so given what the evidence we have so far, a dead guy laying face down, which of these explanations can I cross off? Suicide? Well, if he intentionally took too many pills, he would look like that. If he accidentally took too many pills, he would look like that. If he just had a heart attack naturally, he'd look like that. If I poisoned him with too many pills, he'd look like that. So you see, right now, I cannot cross out anything because every possible explanation is still reasonable. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't care about possible. I only care about reasonable. Anything and everything is possible. So if you ask me, isn't it possible X, I will always say yes. Because anything's possible. It's possible we were imagining this whole thing. This whole day could have been a dream. You could still be in bed, dreaming the entire day. This could be the Matrix. You just haven't taken the pill yet. This could be, some people believe our entire universe is nothing more than a computer simulation. So all of this may not be, but that's possible. But that's why the standard of proof is not beyond a possible doubt, because you'd never get there. You'd never convict anybody. The standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is much lower than possible, because that's the standard we're trying to make. Anything is possible, but not everything is reasonable. Make sense? Right now, I can't cross out anything, though. So let's go back to our scenario and change it. What if he's a dead guy laying face down, but now he's in a pool of his own blood, center torso? That would change things. We have to add that dimension to our list of evidences, so let's do that right now. So now we've got a pool of blood. He's laying face down. What can I cross out? Well, if he had like a brain aneurysm, hits the deck, and he bleeds out through his nose. Well, if that was the case, the blood would be over here, right? I'm trying to figure out what natural part of your upper torso you could bleed from. It's possible it's a natural, but I don't think it's reasonable, so I can cross that one out. Can I cross out anything else? Not really. I got to kind of roll him over and see what the injury is, right? So let's go back and change our scenario. Now he's a dead guy laying face down in a pool of his own blood, but he's got a single gunshot wound in his torso, and it's an exit wound coming out of his back. That changes things. Let's go back to our list. I can now add this to the list. Back up. What can I cross out now? I can cross out accidental? What if he didn't know the gun was loaded? He shoots himself. That's an exit wound. Got to leave that in. I think I got to leave suicide in too, right? He could shoot himself that way. You might think, well, who would shoot himself that way? Well, look, a lot of the suicides we get to go to are people who are high when they commit the suicide. You see all kinds of crazy suicides. I got to leave that in. I think I got to leave in homicide. Can't change anything. But what if laying next to his body there is a note, a suicide note? written in his own handwriting, on a piece of paper we find elsewhere in the room. With a pen, we find similar pens in the room. It's only got his DNA on it, skin cell transfer. It's only got his fingerprints on it. And it's laying right next to the body. Would that change things? I think it would. Let's put that on our list. Can I cross out anything now? Yeah, I mean, he may have accidentally killed himself before he intended to kill himself, but it looks like he intended to kill himself, right? So I can now cross that out. So now, it's a suicide, right? Okay, who said not necessarily? You've seen this presentation at your church. No, you weren't there that day, were you? It's got a suicide note laying on the floor. It's in his own handwriting. It's his fingerprints, his paper. Doesn't matter. So how did this happen? Someone forced him to write his own, because you've been watching Criminal Minds. Which is a stupid show. People in this room have done homicides. That is nothing like the way we do a homicide, okay? So if you're watching that stuff, no, please. All right, let's go back to our scenario for a second here. Since you people are so suspicious, let's make it clear. What if he had, instead of a single gunshot wound, what if he had multiple gunshot wounds to his back? And what if they were entry wounds, not exit wounds? What if there was, on the note, we look for the note, there's no other paper like that anywhere in the room, there's no other pen anywhere in the room like that, it's not his handwriting, and it's not his fingerprints on it, it's an unknown. That would change things, don't you think? What if there was bloody footprints leading out of the room? Now we're on the same page, right? Okay, so let's put that in, here's our scenario. These are now all entry wounds, there's your note now with foreign fingerprints on it. This is clearly a California murder, you can see right there. That is the beach out there, I'm sure. So now we've got to add this to our list. And after adding this to the list, can you see that given what we have in the room, the evidence, now we have only one reasonable explanation. The other three are certainly still possible, but they're not reasonable. And this is what we do in every homicide investigation, right? We start off with a list of evidences in the room. This is what we ask every jury to do when they're assessing our case versus the case offered by the defense. We are saying which of these explanations is best, most reasonable. This is called abductive reasoning. We've also done something else here that I'm not sure you saw. I'm going to point it out to you. And it's a simple trick. I call it inside or outside the room. Here's how we do it. We say to ourselves, can I explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room? If I can, this is probably not a homicide. Make sense? Let me show it to you visually. So instead of having this room, we'll make it something clearer. We'll make him in a little box. So there he is. Now the question is, can I explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room? Let's try it. Let's say, for example, this note has got his handwriting on it, his fingerprints on it. It's on paper that I find elsewhere in the room. It's on the pen that I find elsewhere in the room. I don't need to go outside the room in order to explain how that got there. He's in the room with the note. It's all his fingerprints. It's his paper. It's his handwriting. I can now explain the note by staying inside the room. And I talk to somebody and they say, yeah, that's his gun. He's owned it for years. He keeps it in the safe in the corner of the room. And he loves that gun. He's had it for years. And sure enough, it's registered to him and it's only got his skin cell transfer on it. I mean, it's his gun. Now I can explain the gun by staying inside the room. And anyone can shoot themselves once without any help from anyone outside the room. So I can even explain the single gunshot wound by staying inside the room. And if this is the case, it's going to be one of these three. Of course, it's not going to be a natural. In this case, it would be an accidental or a suicide. Because everything I need to cause this crime is in the room with him. He can explain all of it. Now, if on the other hand, the best explanation is outside the room. So if, say, for example, I look at that note and that note does not have his fingerprints on it, doesn't have his skin cell transfer, it's not his handwriting, it's a foreign piece of paper I cannot even place anywhere else in the room. Well, now I got to go outside the room to figure out whose DNA that is, whose fingerprints are those, where'd that paper come from? And, let's say they say, oh no, he's afraid of guns. He's never owned a gun. He would never even touch a gun. And sure enough, the numbers have been scratched off this gun, and then it doesn't have any of his transfer on it. It's basically an unknown weapon that's never been seen by anybody who lives there, and I have no idea where it came from, so now I got to go outside the room to figure out where that came from. And it's kind of hard to shoot yourself multiple times in the back without some help. Better explanation is that someone else did that. And finally, I've got footprints that lead outside the room. Clearly, that's best explained by a cause outside the room. Now, everything shifts once the stuff inside the room has an outside cause. Now I have to consider homicide. Why? Because I now have evidence of an intruder. And intruders change everything. In fact, it's intruders that turn death scenes into crime scenes. It's intruders that turn that sense of curiosity you might have about why somebody would kill themselves or how they could die accidentally into a sense of urgency, because the only show on TV that kind of gets it right, it's a boring show. Have you guys ever seen it? It's called The First 48. Have you guys ever seen that? I mean, it's pretty cut and dry, right? But it's just a guy with the camera who's following around detectives in the first 48 hours. The longer we wait, the harder it is to solve it. So this is a process that I use in every death scene to determine if it's a crime scene. And I was about 35 years old when I first started considering whether or not God existed. And I thought, couldn't I take a similar approach to the existence of God? In other words, what if the room under consideration was not a death scene, but was just the entire natural physical universe? Could I play the same game of inside or outside? In other words, could I explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room? I see stuff in the universe. We all experience life in the universe. And we all have certain characteristics of the universe we have to explain. The question is, can I explain them by staying inside the room? In other words, all I can use that's in the room is what's available to me under naturalism, which is just space-time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry that govern space-time and matter. That's it. I've got to figure out a way to explain everything in the room by just staying inside the room for an explanation. And I think there are a number of things we have to explain. We have to first explain how the room got here. Because we know from science, not from theology, that everything in the universe, all space, time, and matter, came into existence from nothing. And that's really caused physicists to try to redefine what nothing is. Because if it came from nothing, it means it didn't come from space, time, and matter. Those things did not exist until the universe began to exist. We know what nothing is philosophically. Nothing is the stuff that Aristotle says is the stuff that rocks dream about. Nothing. But that means if we're looking for a cause of all space, time, and matter, it has to be something that's not made of space, time, or matter, because that wasn't available until the universe came into existence. We're looking for a non-spatial, immaterial, atemporal first cause. But that means we're already outside the room of naturalism just to get the first answer. But forget that for now. We also have to explain the fine-tuning of the universe, why the cosmological constants are tuned so precisely that any small variation in those constants will not even produce a universe that can sustain itself, let alone life in the universe. Also, we have to explain how life emerges from non-life in the universe. We have to explain the code in the DNA. We also have to explain why biological life has the appearance of design. That's a rather non-controversial statement. Even Richard Dawkins agrees that there is the appearance of design in biology. The question is, how do we explain the appearance of design? And we are thinking about this using our conscious minds. But if we are atheists, as I was, I don't know how I could account for the immaterial thing we call consciousness, when I only believe that everything in the universe came through a series of physical processes. I can believe in a brain, but like Sam Harris, the neurophysicist, or neuroscientist, who is also a philosopher, he does not believe we have minds. He believes we have brains, and the mind is an illusion. But the problem with that, of course, is that if we only have physical brains, then all of our decisions are not really freely made. They are simply the consequence of prior physical events like dominoes that fall, neurons that fire. So Sam not only denies mind, he also denies the kind of free agency that we all experience. He thinks that's also an illusion. But we have evidence of this. We have our own common experience of it. And finally, we have to talk about how it is we believe that some things are morally good or morally bad, and we also have to explain the problem of evil. I think we have a duty to try to explain this one of two ways. Either we can explain these things by staying inside the room, or we have to go outside the room for an explanation. If we have to go outside the room for an explanation, we are stuck again with an intruder problem. only this intruder would span the entire cosmos. And that's why I tried to call this book God's Crime Scene, but my publisher was like, no, you can't use that title. That title sounds like you think that God's committed a crime. I'm just saying that you could actually look at the universe using the same tools we would use in a crime scene to see if the first cause is inside or outside the room. Now we're going to go back to this model. I am not going to spend all night tonight talking about the evidence in all those 8 categories. I teach this class at Biola. It takes me 17 hours to go through those 8 categories. So we have locked the doors and we're going to hold you in here for 17 straight hours. But no, we're not going to do that. So therefore, God exists. So I've just proved to you that God exists because we're not going to hold you here for 17 hours. But we're going to take this model of comparing evidences to explanations and we're going to move it to the universe and simply ask the question, given these pieces of evidence in the universe, which of these 2 explanations, either staying inside the room or moving outside of naturalism, is the most reasonable inference from evidence? And we're going to stay in the latter category tonight. We're just going to talk about the last 2 pieces. Very briefly, we're going to talk about piece number 7, which is that we all recognize that there are objective moral truths in the universe. What I mean by objective moral truths is there are some things that we would say, collectively, we all agree, are objectively wrong. They're not a matter of personal opinion. I first started thinking about this when I was working gangs in Los Angeles County. That's back when we all had to have mustaches like that. That was a prerequisite. I still had hair color back then. Look at that. I was gray over here, but I still had hair color over there. Dang. Anyway, I remember talking to some gangsters who had committed a pretty horrific crime. A guy named Jesse, his sister had, a local gangster of a rival clique had kind of hit on his sister. And he took such great offense to that they captured this rival gang member and they just slowly tortured him until finally he died. And when I talked to him about this, he felt like this was entirely appropriate. You know, according to his code, he would expect that to be done to him if he had hit on somebody else's sister. So he didn't see what was wrong with it. And as I talked to him, he certainly held the personal opinion that this was okay, and his group affirmed him. They also believed it was okay. So I started thinking about, who gets to decide if something is okay? There's kind of a hierarchy, right? A moral hierarchy. And at the bottom are just individuals, people like Jesse, who get to decide things. If all moral truths are simply the result of your thoughts, they're your personal opinions, the problem, of course, would be, is what if you disagree with you? Who gets to adjudicate between these 2 guys? I could never say that he's right or that he's right. I'd say you're both got to be right and wrong, I guess, because if all moral truth is established by individuals, subjects, well, then I can't see any subject is wrong, because the subject is to say, I get to decide. So I don't think we would camp there. We might say that his group gets to decide, but then if his rival group says that's not okay to do, how do I adjudicate between 2 cliques? Now the city of LA has rules that it forces every gangster to obey. It's kind of an overarching moral code, but not every city operates the same way. And the municipal codes in San Diego are different than the municipal codes in LA. But we have a state of California, of course, which overarches on top of all of that. And you can only do certain things in our Cal. But to be honest, it's different in Arizona. That's okay, we have a nation, and the nation kind of has federal laws that attempt to unify and straighten out some of the differences between states. But our country disagrees with other countries on certain laws. That's okay, we have the United Nations, and the United Nations then can kind of try to overarch and mediate problems between nations. My question is, how high does this moral hierarchy go? How do we adjudicate between 2 nations that disagree? Well, how do we get above nations? Who's that judge? If there's a Star Trek world, who adjudicates between the Klingons and the Romulans? That's the problem. For example, we could say there are some things we all agree are never okay to do. No matter who you are, where you are, or when you were in history. It's never been okay to torture babies for the fun of it. As a matter of fact, if you just take that out for the fun of it, and you put that on behind any statement, it's never okay to steal for the fun of it. You might have a reason you could justify stealing. I stole the code that saved 1 million lives. They're going to put that code in the machine. They're going to blow up 1 million people, but I stole the code so they couldn't do it. Okay, you could justify it, but stealing for the fun of it, that's not okay to do. And I think this is true not just for him, but it's true all the way up there. Who gets to decide this? He actually thought that it was okay to torture a rival over what that was okay for him. And his group thought it was okay. Oh, I didn't think it was okay. But who gets to decide here? Who in the hierarchy gets to decide whether it's okay or not? That was the question I had. And I think in the end, it's going to come down to some ultimate group, some ultimate source of moral behavior, an ultimate judge. Now you'll notice that all of these are people groups, and that's important. Every one of these groups we've talked about, whoever it is who gets to decide what is morally true, are persons. And that is important to recognize, because if you'll notice, I have no moral obligation to my police car. I have no moral obligation to this podium. I can hit it. I can kick it. I don't feel bad about it. I have no moral obligation to an object. I have no moral obligation to my flashlight. I only have moral obligation. By the way, I have no moral obligations to physics. If physics are the source of everything we see in the universe, why do we feel moral obligations? You're not morally obligated to physics. But you are morally obligated to people groups. I am morally obligated not to my car, but to the partner sitting next to me in that car. Not to my flashlight or to anyone's flashlight, but to the person who's holding the flashlight. Moral obligations are always between persons. And if that's true, the question I have is, if there are overarching moral truths that are at this level, and I think there are, because, for example, nations don't agree. So we would say what you guys did, what the Germans did to the Jews in World War II is not okay. They said it was okay. They even went to the trials in Nuremberg saying, you can't prosecute us. In our culture, we were told that we would get promoted if we did this kind of thing. So we all said, okay, we're in. We were actually venerated for doing this kind of thing. You can't, just because you won the war, come in here and say that now we're going to get prosecuted for this because your culture doesn't like it. It was okay in our culture. And what did the judge from our nation say? Well, there's a law above the law. Well, if there is a law above the law, and that's where moral obligations reside, then my question is going to be, who is the transcendent, objective, moral person to whom we are feeling obligated? If it's just physics, why do we have moral obligations? You might have moral truths, but obligations require persons. And Dawkins, I think, kind of describes the way it would be in the universe if there was no moral person and it was just physics. He would say the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And that's what the physics are. They are indifferent. They don't care. Physics doesn't care what you do. So if I had to look at this and say, well, does it come from individuals, subjects, even if it came from groups of subjects, I think we have problems. Of course, we could just deny these exist at all, and some people do that. There are other ways to explain moral grounding, and if you want to talk about it in the Q&A, we'll talk about it there, okay? But for me, these are at least 3 ways that we could get moral truths by staying inside the room of the universe, but these don't work. They don't work because we can't adjudicate between persons. Every moral action would have to be equal. We can't adjudicate between groups. Every group would have to be equally virtuous. And by the way, if you think that groups determine moral truth, then we better get ready to do whatever China tells us to do, because they are the largest group. And it would simply be whatever majority of subjects says is true, under that theory, it would have to be true. And anything held by the smaller group would, by its very definition, be immoral. Of course, if there are no moral truths, we have to kind of deny our own experience of the world. We believe there are. Now, on the other hand, if moral truths are grounded in the nature of a moral being that transcends the universe, this would explain why we find and feel obligations, moral obligations, inside the room. But we would have to go outside the room for this kind of being. Jerry Fodor puts it this way: science is about facts, not norms. It might tell us how we are, but it couldn't tell us what is wrong with how we are. There couldn't be a science of the human condition. If, on the other hand, there is a personal source of moral truth and obligation outside the room, that might explain why we sense moral obligations inside the room. Let me just go one more step with you, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, because this last one here is where I get a lot of questions. Okay, so tell me how it is then that if there's an all-loving God, he would allow the world to be the way it is. I get this question a lot from families. It usually comes in the form of, why would this happen to my loved one? Why would a good God allow this? I had a case years ago. It was my dad's case first. This is my dad over here. My dad worked in this industry also. So we have 3 Jim Wallaces who work in law enforcement. He started in 1961. I was born in his academy. I took over in 1988. My son was born in my academy. He is now working there now. So we have 3 Jim Wallaces at our agency. Sometimes people will call and somebody will answer, this is Jim Wallace, and they'll say, old voice with, this is Jim Wallace? Yeah. You're still working there? No, I'm his grandson. He's not working here anymore, because that's how long we've been using this name. And this is a case from 1972. It happened on a holiday. This young man was accused of killing a 10-year-old girl in our city. He confessed to the case, about a 1,000-page transcript. It's pretty horrific. As it turns out, he was not our killer. He confessed to it, but he never matched the evidence, really. And we eventually eliminated him about 2 years later. So this is still an open case. We just solved it about a month and a half ago using Ancestry DNA, which is awesome, right? So I want to thank all of you who are stupid enough to get your ancestry done, because now we're taking all of your loved ones to jail. It's awesome. But the question their family had is, and I will call this young girl Jackie for the sake of this, because we haven't published the case yet, but why would an all-loving, all-powerful God allow this to happen to my daughter? She was attacked brutally. She was eventually killed, and she was discarded 1 coast north of us on the California coastline in Oxnard. And the family would ask this question, why would this happen? Okay, you want me to answer this question. Why would this happen to your daughter? Well, there's a couple of ways I got to answer it. First of all, I have to think about it as a crime. Why would this crime occur to Jackie? Well, it's never as simple as you might think. And the act of solving cases is about answering that question. Why did this happen to Jackie, and who did it, right? But there are many factors involved. I will tell you this. If Jackie isn't the kind of girl who would get into a stranger's car without questioning, she doesn't die that day. But she was the kind of girl who would get into a stranger's car. So that is one piece of the puzzle that I have to consider. Otherwise, I'd be looking for somebody who knew her. But no, it turns out I don't have to look for someone who knew her, because she would get into a stranger's car. That opens up my suspect pool huge, right? Also, it happened on a holiday. If it hadn't happened on a holiday, if it hadn't been a holiday where her parents were like, hey, I need you kids to get out and play in the front yard, play in the front street, do not come in here for 2 hours, we're making dinner. If this isn't a holiday and she isn't the kind of kid who gets into a car, doesn't happen. And I've worked these kinds of cases before. Usually if you work cases involving pedophiles, you'll find that those folks have had a disturbing upbringing of their own. If he doesn't have that kind of disturbing upbringing, this isn't a holiday and she doesn't get into his car, this doesn't happen. And it was in a very unusual, niche-y part of our city, a weird kind of corner of our city that is not on a major thoroughfare. I don't know how anyone would know how to get into that corner of our city and how to get out. If somebody who knew how to do that was at least familiar with that area. If he doesn't know how to do that, doesn't have that kind of upbringing, and she isn't the kind of person who gets into that car on a holiday, this doesn't happen. These 4 conditions had to be met before this happens. You see how we're puzzling this? Not only that, he has to have the kind of car in which he could commit this crime in privacy. He did happen to have that kind of car. And he has to have the window of opportunity in order to... Look, if these things don't happen, if these 6 ingredients are not in place, she doesn't die that day. But these just happen to be in place. So if you're asking me, well, why did this happen to her from a criminal perspective? From a criminal perspective, I would say, well, I have to consider these 6 elements. I don't know exactly what the relationship is between these 6 elements, which are primary, which are secondary, which are tertiary. I don't know. I got to figure that out. And then that's going to explain any particular act of evil, including what happened to Jackie. Does that make sense? This is how we work criminal cases. We try to puzzle back, given what we do know. Now, I showed you a diagram earlier around the box about the evidence that I actually do think points to God as the best explanation. And I think that these 7 things typically people will use when they talk about whether or not God exists. But there's an 8th thing we're going to talk about now, and that is evil. These first 7 things, if they do point to God as a causal suspect, we would call these inculpating pieces of evidence. That's the name for that. But we have to consider evil an additional thing. The question is this thing something that points away from God? In other words, I could have good reasons to believe you're the suspect, but then if I find out you got an alibi and you were out of the state on the day of the murder, well, I don't care how good my other 7 things are. He's got an alibi. So that is called exculpating evidence. Is that what evil is? Is evil the thing that eliminates God as a candidate for these other 7 things? That's what we're going to talk about before we go to Q&A. Epicurus put it this way famously, and I don't even know that Epicurus actually said this, but it's always attributed to him, so I'll go ahead and go along with the joke, okay? But I think he probably is the person who first said this. And he said it like this: is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Well, then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Well, then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? What I think he's saying here in English is, if God is all-powerful, well, then couldn't he stop this? If he can't stop it, he's not all-powerful. If he doesn't care to stop it, you can't call him all-loving. So if he supposedly is all-powerful and does care, why wouldn't he stop it? Well, I think it comes down to the same way we put together the case for Jackie. In the first diagram, I tried to show you how we might address it from a criminal perspective. How do we solve what happened to Jackie? But now I'm being asked something different. How could God allow this to happen to Jackie? That's a different question. But I think we answer it the same way on the grounds of several factors we have to consider, like the role of eternity, or the importance of free agency, or our definition of what love is, or just the fact that we have to know what role this plays in character development and calling, in terms of also simply we do stupid things sometimes, we get judged for doing stupid things, and finally, do we have enough information to even know the answer to begin with? Now, I actually think that these 7 things are the 7 pieces of the puzzle, just like the 6 pieces I showed you for solving the crime related to Jackie. These are 7 pieces of the puzzle that have to be used to solve the second question, is why did this happen to Jackie? This is how I explain any act of evil. It's always going to be a cumulative case in which several factors are going to be considered. For example, we have to talk about eternity here, because I think eternity changes everything when I start thinking about why would an all-loving God allow this to happen? Here's what I mean by that. As an atheist, for 35 years, I believed that all of life was simply a line segment from birth, right, to death. Birth to death. 2 dots. 1 on each. And I wanted 90 pain-free years. My dad would always say, my dad's a very committed atheist, he would always say, yeah, my goal is to live 90 years pain-free, great 90 years. And how he always say it, how he used to say, live 90 years and then die at the hands of a jealous boyfriend. That's what my dad would say. Think about it. Just give it a few minutes, it'll sink in later. So I wanted 90 pain-free because I have longevity in my family. I thought, hey, I want to die peacefully in my sleep at the age of 90 after I played a round of golf. But if I was to get to 40 and then get cancer and suffer for 10 years and drop dead at 50, I'm going to be PO'd. Right? Because I'm thinking I wanted 90, number 1, and now I got to suffer for 10 and all this is lost. This is evil because I'm not going to experience any of this. It turns out evil is measured in the context of our lives. That's how we decided this is evil. By the way, if I had lived to 89 and 11 months and then I got an illness and died a month later, not so bad. But this is measured in terms of what is lost. That's why we call it evil. Right? But what if I'm wrong about my foundational definition of what life is? What if life is not a line segment at all? What if life instead was a ray that starts at one point and then extends through the thing we call death and then goes off in this direction forever, infinitely? You guys know your geometry, that's a ray, right? What if life is a ray and not a line segment? That would change things. There are some of you in this room right now who could tell me that when you were born, You had some really bad defect that needed to be operated on. And so you had a surgery. And if I had stopped you in that first month when you were being cut and open and all the pain you went through, and I said, hey, how's life going for you? You would say, it stinks. This is a terrible way. Why would I even be here given all the pain I've experienced? But by the time you were like 3, you forgot about it. You don't even remember it. It's so far in your rearview mirror, it doesn't even matter anymore. This is evil. But by the time you live this life, not such a big deal. I mean, pain, no one wants to suffer through pain. But you got through it, and then you lived a long life. Now, if this view of life I'm describing now as a ray is true, now just go with me, I don't think you have to believe it's true, but if it were true, if life was a ray instead of a line segment, that's what Christianity, that's what most theistic worldviews will offer, if life is a ray instead of a segment, well, then we have to reconsider everything. I don't care how much pain you suffer in your life here, if it's 90 years, every year you're in eternity, this seems smaller and smaller and smaller by comparison. So you're 1,000 years into eternity. I don't care how bad your first 90 were. It's like, whatever. This is evil. It could all be evil, but it's measured in the context of this, if this is the way life really is. And that's why I do think that the idea, the notion of eternity, changes the way we see the problem of evil. Because we can't always say to ourselves, wow, I can't believe she's already dead. Well, if this is true, she's not dead. I also have to kind of think about the role of free agency. And a lot of people talk about it. I talk about it maybe a little bit differently, but I think this is an important thing for us to talk about. Look, if we're looking at two kinds of possible worlds, a world in which love is possible or a world in which love is impossible, which of these two versions do you think God would create if God is loving? Because the claim is that God's all-loving. I think he's going to create a world in which love is possible, because why would you call him a loving God if he creates a world where nobody could love? Now, my wife and I have been together for about 40 years, and we got married on Valentine's Day. So let's say I split up with her a couple of years ago on Valentine's Day, and I decided to try to win her back, and Valentine's Day comes around next year. And so on February 13th, I buy a card, and I put it in the mail, and I send it to her in an effort to win her back. This is the card I would send her, right? This makes sense. You will love me. Roses are red, bullets are lead, take me back now or get shot in the head. I think that's a beautiful card. I don't think it'll work, because I can put a gun to her head and ask her, do you love me? And she's going to say, what? Yeah, I love you. But it wouldn't be true love. Any way to compel her to say something that she doesn't freely believe on her own, it would not be genuine. So it turns out if you want this crazy thing called love in the world, by logical necessity, you have to first put something dangerous in place. You have to put something called free agency in place. But that means people have to have the freedom to hate. They may not love, but you will not get love if you don't give people the freedom to hate. It would be a logically inconsistent world. And if there is a God, he has the power to eliminate logical inconsistencies. So these two kinds of worlds, this is the problem. This world in which love is possible is a very dangerous place to live. Yes, love is possible, but all kinds of bad things happen under free agency. Now look, a loving God would not throw the knife at you and not tell you how to catch it by the handle or the blade. That would be crazy. So a loving God would give you this dangerous foundational tool called free agency, and then he would give you a book that would explain how to not misuse the dangerous thing. That's different. Now, if you don't want to read the book, or you want to disregard the book, well, then don't be surprised when you misuse the tool. But that's not because God doesn't love us. He's given us both the dangerous tool and the instruction guide. Now, think about this for a second. We've been talking about love and all-loving God, but what do we even mean when we say that? What definition of love are we using? I think we sometimes get caught into the kind of cultural definitions of love, right? These are the words that we typically associate with love. But if you're a parent in this room, you know I left off one, right? You all know I left that one off. That word is called tough love. That's got to be on that wall. And I think parents get this. So I have 4 kids. I have a son, Jim, who is he's now a training officer at our agency. I have a son, David, who's an anesthesiologist. I can barely say the word, let alone understand what he's doing. And then I've got 2 daughters that are 23 and 21. Now, my daughter, Annie, when she first moved away to go to college, she decided that she was going to drop out of school. And I said to her, okay, I get it. School's not for everyone. But if you drop out of school, that means you will be untethered. Right? Because I would not be doing you a service as a parent to falsely prop you up when in fact you can't support yourself. So you got to figure out, can you do this on your own? And for 2 years, she did it on her own. She was amazing. But she called us earlier this year and said, I'm going to go back to school. And she's now checked back into school. Now, during that time, when she was out of school, like her car would break down. And she would never call and ask, okay, that's not who she is. But I'd hear about it. And I would like, oh man, I should just send her the money to fix the car. But I didn't. Because I could be doing every month. I could find some reason to send her money. And I knew that that was not going to serve her well long term. I had to do this lousy thing on the bottom that nobody wants to do. Yeah, I don't want to do that. And I think sometimes we think that God is just here to kind of check our demand list off like Santa Claus. But that's not what God is. If he is a parent, yeah, he might be involved in all these things, of course, but he'd also be involved in that thing. And so when that happens, we're like, where the heck is God? Well, he might be just doing that. C.S. Lewis is really an apologist ahead of his time, but I want to read you what he says about this. I think he gets it perfectly. He says, we want, in fact, not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven. You know, a senile benevolence who, they say, like to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was that simply, it might be truly said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. That's what grandparents do. That's not what parents do. I can't wait to be a grandfather so I can mess up my kids' lives, right? I'm going to spoil those kids like crazy. But that's what grandfathers do, not what fathers do. And fathers are the ones who say, no, I can't send that. Look, this is go back to our timeline for a second. So you have this part of your life right here, which is your temporal life, right? And this is kind of your eternal life. You might say this is your life here on earth, and this is your life after earth, okay? Now you've got parents, and your parents are the ones who steward you over this part of your life, right? And so a parent over here might allow something bad to happen to you over here because they're trying to achieve something good over here. That's what I was doing with Annie. But if theism is true, if God exists, he would be over the entire timeline. All of it. And you might say, well, yeah, but I've known people who had bad things happen to them and nothing good ever came of it. Well, yeah, stupid. He's not just dealing with this part of your life. He has the entire timeline. He might be trying to achieve something over there. You just don't know. You're not going to see it in this life. He's got domain over all of it. And you know that if you really love someone, you don't give a lick about their comfort. You care about their character. And when you love someone, you aim at the things that last, the things that are long. Now, this is the next explanation I will tell you. This is a factor we have to consider, but I used to think it was one of the worst explanations ever for the problem of evil. This idea that somehow God would use evil in our lives to develop our character? Really? Like he couldn't find an easier way to do this? But even as an atheist, there were some things that I would have said I wanted to see in my world. These things I wanted to see in my world. These were virtues that even as an atheist, I said were my high virtues. I want to live in a world. My dad right now will tell you that he also wants to live in a world that has these characteristics. But if God wanted to get these characteristics, are you sure you want that really? Because you know these things don't just come when you snap your fingers. Each of these moral virtues is achieved in response to a hardship. You don't just snap your fingers and get courage. You get courage once you've had to face danger. You want compassion? Really? Well, that means you're going to have to face some suffering. You want forgiveness? Well, then what evil are you going to forgive? You want self-sacrifice? Well, that means you're going to have some kind of hardship. You're going to have some kind of poverty if you want charity. In other words, if you wanted all those high virtues, you would have to design a world that looks like this. And that's exactly what we have. That's how you get the virtues we all say are so virtuous. This is why I never pray for patience. Who does that? Think about it. That's a stupid thing to pray for. Because what is God going to do then? He's going to bring you something that you have to be patient about. I hate that. Lewis puts it this way: to ask that God's love should be content with us as we are is to ask that God should cease to be God. Because He is what He is, His love must, in the nature of things, be impeded and repelled by certain stains in our present character. And because He already loves us, He must labor to make us lovable. There are times when I think there are probably some stories in this room in which people have become Christians or have become believers or have come to God because they've had an experience that basically shook them to their core. And they realized that their priorities were messed up and they actually became believers as a result. Now, that's tough. I get it. But I think there are times when God can use evil to get our attention. And I used to think, hey, really? God can just do it easy, right? He's got people He wants to reach. He could just gently reach out and rope them in. Right? Could do that for me. Well, He was trying to do that with me, I think. He wrote me a letter I never read. Refused to open it. Didn't even own one until I was 35. I think my mom had one. I know my dad had one. He's an atheist. Didn't want to read it. I was working on a surveillance team at the time. I was in a car 10 hours a day following guys around who were doing bank robberies. It was a great job. But I had a hard time finding things to listen to because in that time in Los Angeles, it seemed like every third radio station was a Christian radio station. It was hard to avoid all that stuff, but I managed to avoid it. And I even had people in my life that would have tried to share. I managed to avoid them too. Well, if you don't want to come this way, the way that a lot of people come to faith, well, He can do it another way. He can either draw you or He could push you. But if He's going to push you, He's probably going to do it through some kind of suffering. Through something that'll grab you. So when you're finally at the bottom, you got no place to look but up. Lewis puts it this way: let me implore the reader to try to believe, if only for the moment, that God, who made these deserving people, may really be right when He thinks that their modest prosperity and the happiness of their children are not enough to make them blessed. That all this must fall from them in the end. There are times when the most self-sufficient people I know are the people who are least interested in God. So sometimes God will work to make you less self-sufficient. I think also we got to think about sometimes justice just demands a certain response. Look, we all want this God that is loving, but remember that love is directly connected to justice. You cannot have love without justice. So if I told my son David, we're driving down the street and I say, David, I just want you to know I love you to death. I think you're a great man. I'm so proud of you. But then at the next corner, I see a guy robbing a liquor store run across the street in front of us and I say, stop, Mr. Robber. I just want you to know I love you to death. I respect the hell. If I just say the same thing to him I just said to my son David, well then David's going to think, really? That meant nothing what you said to me, because you'll say that to anybody. If you will not justly dispense your mercy, it's just a platitude. There are people you will say I love you to and people you will not say that to, which makes, when you do say it, it means something. Love without justice is just a word. Justice without love, though, is tyranny. So you have to have both of these things. This terrible balance of justice and mercy. They are perfectly represented in the nature of God, but we always get it wrong. But just remember, a loving God is a just God, and there are three forms of justice in our country, and I think all parents understand this. One form of justice simply looks in the rearview mirror. It's like when you're mad about something your kid did yesterday. It's like, I just want to slap the dog snot out of that kid because yesterday he did this, and I'm just mad about yesterday. And I get it, you want some kind of retribution, right? I want to punish this kid for what he did in the past. But most of us, if we're parents, we try not to do that. I think most of the time we punish as parents, we're doing something that looks forward, not backwards. This is called utilitarian justice. In other words, I'm going to say this to my son or my daughter, usually it's my daughter Mia. I'll say, Mia, look, I'm not punishing you, I'm not mad about yesterday. No, I'm not mad about yesterday. But I know if you continue to do that, you're going to train wreck your entire life. So because I'm concerned about tomorrow, and I'm concerned about your future, I am now going to put some consequence to what you did yesterday. It's forward looking. But there will be a consequence. Now, she might not like that. She might think that doesn't seem fair. But it's because I'm concerned about her forward movement. And there are just times when you have to pay back for things you've done wrong. This is the three systems of justice that are in our judicial system. And I think all parents get this, and all parents do this. And if God is our parent, He will do it too. Finally, I think we have to be honest about how little we know and how this weighs into the equation. Let me go back to the actual complaint offered by Epicurus. So here it is. He said, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then He is not omnipotent. Is He able but not willing? Then He is malevolent. The first part of this really is talking about, is He willing but not able? That's about whether or not He's powerful enough. The second part is about whether or not He's loving enough. Make sense? This is why it feels like a dilemma. But what Epicurus did was he left out, this is not, by the way, the definition of God as we know it, as a Christian, for example. It's not that definition. It's part of the definition, but it's not all of it. It turns out that the thing that Epicurus left off is the thing that solves the dilemma, which is why I think he left it off. It's not just that God is all-powerful, He is, and He's all-loving, He is. It's that He's also all-knowing. And because He knows the future now, He might allow certain things to happen because He knows the consequence if He does or doesn't do something. So here's our timeline again. This is the stuff that we know about, but this is the stuff that God knows about. Let's put it this way. A French Dominican priest once said it that he wished he could here's what he said. He said, if God could concede me His omnipotence for 24 hours, you would see how many changes I would make in the world. But if He gave me His wisdom too, I think I would leave things just as they are. Because we don't know what butterfly effect anything happening today might have 200 years from now, or 1,000 years from now. Well, really, a life could be lost because you're trying to, because remember, life is not a line segment. The life isn't really lost. It's just He's managing what's going to happen at any point in your life, remembering that everything that you do in your life is connected to someone else's life. We've all seen enough science fiction to know that's true, right? So again, we go back to this. Look, these are the things that I would have to assess to figure out why God would allow any act of evil. Kind of the same way I build cases. Of course, the problem here is I don't know which of these is a priority to God in any particular act of evil. So I'm not in God's mind to know what He's prioritizing here. But I know the 7 things that God would have to prioritize are those 7 things. The question is, I don't even know what relationships there are between these 7 things. It's a more complicated mess, but in the end, this is how we explain an act of evil. But let me ask you, though, before we close, why are we calling this evil to begin with? Because you don't like it? You don't like what happened to Jackie? If that's all it is, if it's just a matter of whether you like it or not, if all evil is simply comes from what you think in your mind, well, then you could eliminate all evil tomorrow by simply changing your opinion. But that won't work because you're not the standard. It's not even what the group thinks is evil, because there are some groups who wouldn't think that's evil. It turns out if you want to call this evil, you need a standard above you and above your group that determines what is not evil, what is righteous. This is what C.S. Lewis realized when he was an atheist. He said it this way: my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But where had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? Unless you have a standard of perfection by which you are judging something, how do you call it? It's just your own personal opinion then. Look, the idea here is we're in the room and we have some stuff in the room we have to explain. Now, I think God is the best explanation for everything in the room, but some people might say, well, no, evil eliminates God, it exculpates God, because you can't have an all-loving God who's all-powerful. He would never allow evil to occur. But the problem is, how are you defining evil? It turns out in order to define evil the way that you mean, true evil, objective, transcendent evil would require an objective, transcendent standard. You couldn't have that kind of evil unless there is a God in the room. So it's yet another piece of evidence that points outside the room to a standard of righteousness. When it's violated, we call that evil. Lewis put it this way: of course I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. If there is a standard of righteousness outside the room that transcends all of us, then we would see that any violation. You cannot have the shadows without the sunlight. If there's sunlight, then that would explain why we see shadows. So we started with this room and asked the question, do we play this game? We turned it toward the universe. So before I became a police officer, I was actually an illustrator. I got a bachelor's degree in design and a master's degree in architecture from UCLA. And so I get to draw my own illustrations in all my own books. So these are some of the illustrations out of the book. But I think that the best explanation for these things is actually outside the room. Now, I want to say to you, though, that I've learned a long time ago that at any crime scene that I enter, I can tell you something about my suspect before I ever meet him, or her, but usually him. But my point is, I can tell you something about the suspect because the evidence in the room will at least begin to develop for me a suspect profile. Because I've got to find somebody who can explain all of the evidence in this crime scene. I've got 8 pieces of evidence in the universe. I'm looking for a common causal suspect. It's not going to be Mick Jagger. Do you guys even know who Mick Jagger is? He's been arrested probably as much as anybody I know, but it's not him. Why? Because he can't explain those 8 pieces of evidence in the crime scene. They have certain characteristics that must be in place to explain these 8 things. I'm looking for the spaceless, timeless, immaterial first cause that has fine-tuned the universe for the purpose of life to emerge in the universe, that is the source of all information, because it's intelligent, we find in the genome, is also the designer behind the appearance of design we see in biology, who has created in its own image another set of minds that have free agency, and is the standard for moral good by which we would even judge anything good or bad or evil. That's not Mick Jagger. But that is classically what we think of when we think of God. And I can get to this point without ever opening any holy book. I didn't trust holy books. I will tell you, I had a case a few years ago. I think I've been on Dateline more than anyone in the country, but this case was from 1979. This man was 27 years old when he killed my victim. He was 63 when I took him to jail. Now, the evidence in this was robust, and it was on several different lines. We had some eyewitness testimony. We had some behaviors that he exhibited back when he was a young man after the murder and before the murder. We had some physical property that he left at the crime scene. And we even had some statements of his that we were able to analyze, and we could see that he was lying. He had some deception indicators in his statements. That's called forensic statement analysis. I will tell you that these 4 kinds of evidence are very different. This is witness evidence. Well, a different set of experts we brought into trial to testify about witnesses. This is all behavioral evidence. Another set of experts will come in to talk about that. On the other side, we have some forensic material evidence. We'll have different people from the crime lab come in from that. And finally, we have some forensic statement analysis that will bring in somebody for that. When you have 4 different categories of evidence that all point to the same person, you've got a pretty good inference. Here we have 8 pieces of evidence. And they are in 4 broad categories. 2 are cosmological, 2 are biological, 2 are mental, and 2 are moral. They are completely different experts in every field, from astrophysicists to biochemists to neuroscientists rather, and to just philosophers. If all of them point to the same causal suspect, you probably have a decent inference. Now, I will tell you that in defense cases, what will typically happen is a defense team will come in and say, oh no, Jim, I can explain this different ways. I don't need to use this as an explanation. I could look at those 8 pieces of evidence and I could offer 3 or 4 ways to explain this, and 3 or 4 ways to explain this, and this, and this, and this. And they do that in criminal trials all the time. The problem is that none of these experts think the other one is right. This guy says this guy's an idiot. This guy says, no, he's wrong. And none of these explanations over here can be used to explain this thing over here. These are entirely different sets of causes. And nobody agrees. There's another way to explain those same pieces of evidence, though. I can offer one common causal factor that not only unifies all the evidence, it explains all of it. So the question is, which of these two is a better explanation? We've been looking for a theory of everything for years, a way to kind of unify quantum physics with traditional classic physics. I think there is a theory of everything. It's called God, because it explains everything in the universe and unifies the evidence set. Now, I did bring books tonight, so I'll make one shameless plug for books, but to be honest, I just bought them on my own cost and shipped them here rather than have the publisher do that, so we can give them to you for 10 bucks. So we'll do that. But I've written 3 books that kind of make the case for Christianity. We did not talk about that tonight. As a matter of fact, the case we made tonight you could make if you were a Muslim. There's nothing about tonight's case that is specifically Christian. But we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want to. And so I've finally written a book that really makes a case for why we should make the case, because believe it or not, most Christians do not think any of this matters anyway. Because when you ask Christians, why are you a Christian? Most Christians will tell you, because I was raised this way. That is the absolute most popular answer amongst Christians. They don't even know if there's any evidence to support it. Second most popular answer is, I've had an experience that demonstrated for me it was true. Some kind of an experience. I'll offer something. And by the way, those are the same 2 most popular answers for Muslims, the same 2 most popular answers for Mormons, and for Buddhists, and for everybody. Doesn't make it right or true.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.